the council meeting of November the 14th, 2011. Under allotments, Councillor Mayer was to again request that one item be taken into committee. He was also to advise councillors that he had given advice to one gentleman regarding a sugar beet lifter. This is a prime example of how the parish council's minutes can be vague. Why did he need to give advice regarding a sugar beet lifter? The truth being that one of the tenants on the Bass allotments had grown sugar beet, and he could not get the harvester to harvest the crop into the allotments via the Bass allotments entranceway. This was not something new. It was an issue in 2005. When the parish council sold some land belonging to the Bass's allotments, it was agreed there should be a covenant placed on the land, so that a fence could not be placed on the boundary. When the newly built bungalow was sold, adjacent to the entranceway, the householder then erected a fence. Although Councillor Scott was aware of the fence being erected and was told about the covenant, nothing was done, and the allotment tenant found out that he could not harvest his sugar beet. But fortunately for him, Mr. Pole was a Crown Estate tenant and had some land adjacent, and he permitted him to pass over that land with the sugar beet harvester. That autumn the land was wet. The tenant, not wishing to make a mess of Mr. Pole's land, was to leave the sugar beet harvester on the allotment roadway all winter, and this was then an issue at the parish council's annual meeting of March 2006. But in 2011 the tenant had a problem. Mr. Pole was no longer tenant of the Crown's land adjacent, and the new tenant, Mr. Baird, would not let him pass over his land, although Mr. Baird was quite happy to pass over Mr. Pole's daffodil rows with his tractor and turn on the row ends and even plough some daffodils up. Perhaps he thought that if the tenant had a lot of hassle, he would give his allotments up, and then the parish council would let them allotments to him as well. It appears that Councillor Mayer had contacted the drainage board. The drainage board had then piped a small drain to make another entranceway into the Bass allotment, but between the allotments and the road was a grass strip. It was previously owned by Mr. Pole, but not now, and it appears that the new owner knew nothing of the new access. The clerk was to report a letter from Mr. Buxton regarding shoots on the Crownfield allotments at Holbeach Bank. After discussion, the clerk was instructed to write to the Crown, Carter Jonas, and also the person organising the shoots, asking him to cease immediately. The police also to be informed. Apparently Mr. Buxton was very annoyed. People on the shoot had parked their vehicles on his property, then passed through his boundary hedge to access the allotments. Gary Ebbage was named as the organiser of the shoot, the same Gary Ebbage who for several years had used number 11 Crownfield Bank for game cover. After being let the allotment, after apparently spraying the allotment by mistake, which was mentioned in Councillor Worth's report of October 2000. On the 15th of November, Mr. Pyle was to make a complaint of fraud against Mr. Ebbage to the police. Mr. Pyle had not given permission for Mr. Ebbage to be on his allotments, and if people were paying Mr. Ebbage to be on his shoot, and Mr. Ebbage had inferred that he had got the right to shoot Mr. Pyle's allotments and take the game that was forced to fly from it, then he had made a false representation. On organised shoots, the persons with guns stand at predetermined places. When they are ready, the walkers then walk through the cover crop, making noise, with the aim to force the birds towards the guns. Eventually they'll take flight, and while in the air be shot at. Each bird shot could be worth £30. November was to see Mr. Pole back at the Magistrates' Court in Spalding, this time for non-payment of drainage rates. He had received a demand for and replied back to the Drainage Board, informing them that they still owed him a refund and to recalculate, taking into account the refund. The letter was not replied to, and then Mr. Pole received a reminder for the amount, and a few days later bailiffs arrived, then the court summons. At the court, the Drainage Board representative admitted to receiving the letter. and said the board did not do refunds, Mr. Pole replied, "You did in 2000 to Mr. Watson, when I took his land over." It emerged the amounts owing was calculated on dates given by Mr. Baird as to when he took over Mr. Pole's land. When asked what these dates was, the board's representative was unable to reply. He was also asked regarding the amount, as how they was asking for £601 previously, but at court it was £601. The board's representative was then to state, "Well, we've already been here once, we didn't really need to come. Now, what was your home address?" It appeared that being in court was to find out where Mr. Pole was living. Mr. Pole was adamant that the dates given by Mr. Baird were not correct. If the bailiffs could obtain money from Mr. Pole, then Mr. Baird could possibly avoid paying drainage rates on land that he had been farming. Mr. Pole was to insist that the drainage board recalculate and take into account his refund and let him know, but the drainage board rep insisted that he was not going to write to the address he had been sending letters to, because letters were being returned. As to what letters, it is not known. Mr. Pole told him, "Well, put the householder's name on the letter." At the council meeting of December the 12th, 2011, Councillor Mail was not at the meeting, thus there was no report. The clerk's report was read out by the chairman, Rita Rudkin, as the clerk was not present at the meeting. The chairman reported that the clerk had written to Mr. Ebbage regarding the shoots on the Crownfield allotment, and that a representative had called at the parish office on behalf of Mr. Ebbage, explaining that Mr. Pole had given permission for the shoots on his allotment. The draft minutes read, "It was reported that Mr. Pole had quit his allotments in October 2011, but on signing the minutes in January, added in was being given notice to, and the date changed from October 2011 to October 2012. The council had not asked Mr. Pole if he had given permission or not. From when Rita Rudkin became chair, the council had a clerk and a minute clerk, and it appears the minute clerk then sends the draft minutes to the clerk. So what was typed, was that what the minute clerk had heard, and they added in what the actual clerk actually knew to be the truth? Because the notice to quit the allotments was dated October 12. Mr. Pole was not at the meeting, but was contacted the next day by a parishioner and told what was said at the meeting. On the Wednesday morning of the 14th of December, Mr. Pole went to see the clerk at the council offices, where Mr. Pole was told that Mr. Baird had actually came into the parish council offices and stated that Mr. Pole had given permission for Mr. Ebbage to use the allotments. The clerk was to state that she had got this in writing, as she had had at hand a copy of Mr. Ebbage's letter, and wrote down what Mr. Baird said, and then passed it to him and asked him to sign and date it. The clerk duly provided Mr. Pole with a copy, and Mr. Pole duly provided a copy to Lincolnshire Police. A few weeks after Mr. Baird had visited the Holbeach Parish Council offices, and no letter being received from the Drainage Board, the police were informed of the November appearance at Spalding Magistrates Court and what had been said. 2011 had been a year of change for Holbeach Parish Council, with Granville Hawkes the clerk departing. Also the long-standing park keeper's assistant departing. Cracks had appeared in the parish council office and in the parish council. A letter was published in the local paper in the summertime claiming that Holbeach councillors thought more of flowers than they did of people. This was followed by a flurry of letters from people connected to Pride in Holbeach claiming this was not the case. But ultimately the chairman, Councillor Terry Harrington, was to step down and Pride in Holbeach to be replaced by Holbeach in Bloom. But it was not long before the chairman of Holbeach in Bloom had resigned, and at the Crownfield Bank allotments someone placed a notice on the tenants only sign